So good of you to join us. I'm just wondering, first of all, given the kind of facts that we're now able to report, what strikes you immediately about this? If you were compiling a profile, what would you be underlining at this point?
Well, you know, when we look at these kinds of mass shootings, which really have occurred in the modern era since the early 90s, there really is a pattern that repeats itself over and over again. And we see it, the fact is, beginning to emerge in the profile of Paddock. So there tends to be three kinds of people who commit these kinds of mass shootings. The first are people who have become tremendously despondent. They feel their life is so worthless, either because of a romantic problem, a financial problem, some kind of tremendous stress, that they feel suicidal, and they blame someone. So they have tremendous vengeance, which is at the core of this, which causes them to be homicidal. So when you put that together, they feel like their life is not worth living, and they want to take some group of people who they blame out with it. The second type of person who does this is someone who has certain forms of mental illness. Many forms of mental illness, most, are not violent. But antisocial personality disorder, psychopathology, such as sociopathy, which you mentioned earlier with regard to the father, is a very violent disorder, and I think it's curious that this is in his background. We often see that in these shootings. And the third is, for example, in the Virginia Tech shooting or the Gabrielle Gifford shooting, psychosis, where a person has lost contact with reality. That does not seem to be the case here. So the profile that is beginning to emerge is someone who had antisocial personality in his background, and the facts tend to come out over days. So first people think there are multiple shooters, then they realize there is one shooter. Rumors begin to become facts, and we're beginning to see the pattern of someone who likely was despondent, enraged, and wanted to take people out with himself. Now, there's one other interesting fact, and we should qualify it. Hasn't been verified yet, but some people have stated that his companion, about 45 minutes earlier in the concert, had been offended, had been confronted, and in some kind of an argument had made some kind of statement that she was going to get revenge. This has not yet been confirmed, but it is possible that with someone who was already vulnerable to committing violence, that this might have been the trigger. But this is a man who had 23 weapons, guns, in his suite and another 19 in his home. So this clearly was someone who was oriented towards violence and violent behavior.
It's a fascinating range of factors there, Dr. Lipman. Can I pick you up on a couple of them, because I'm sure viewers would be very interested. You said you're interested in the fact that the father's background, clearly a violent background, has been underlined. To what extent would that have been influential in this case, in this man's psychological makeup? And what would be the conclusions that you might tentatively draw from that?
Well, it's a very important question. On the one hand, the fact is that this is a very unusual case in that most mass shootings that we have seen since 1998 are carried out by young men in their early 20s or sometimes late teens. So the fact that Paddock, as a 64-year-old man, places him as somewhat of an outlier. However, we also know that antisocial personality disorder, psychopathy or sociopathy, has a strong genetic component. This is a man who really was living in some ways on the edges of society. This is a man who clearly had a propensity towards high-risk behavior. His brother described him as someone who made a living through gambling. So as the facts emerge, I think we are going to see someone who exhibited signs of the antisocial behavior that both has a genetic piece as well as the ingrained learned piece that comes through exposure in the family environment.
We mentioned the age, 64. You've underlined again the unusual fact that this was not a young person in this context. Does it surprise you, therefore, that he'd never come to the attention of police or the authorities before?
No, because there is a smaller subgroup of these kinds of crimes. And while it is the case that most mass shootings are the kind of enraged young adult or adolescent who is unable to see the options that are beyond their hopelessness and rage. There also is a smaller subgroup of people who have reached a certain age and they feel that their life has not turned out as they hope, has some kind of romantic or financial crisis, who is driven to a point of complete hopelessness. And if that person has this is very important, has this easy access to semi-automatic weapons that can be easily converted into automatic weapons, that is a very explosive, combustible mixture. You know, in the United States, the NRA likes to say that it's not the gun, it's the person. That is wrong. We see in Australia, where they have the same mental illnesses that we have in the United States, that when reasonable prohibitions are put on these semi-automatic and automatic weapons, that these kinds of mass shootings are virtually wiped out, even though the same mental illnesses exist. It is time in the United States, hear me, for us to recognize that the easy access to semi-automatic and automatic weapons must be changed. It is too much of a sacrifice. They're not needed by the American people. You know, I'm also a lawyer, and under the Heller decision of our Supreme Court, it is allowable, it is a reasonable accommodation under Heller to have control over semi-automatic and automatic weapons, and there have been too many deaths. I've seen this for 30 years. Families will suffer, children will suffer. This will go on, this same cycle, unless we decide as a nation to change this now. Treat mental illness, of course, but take these guns out of the picture.
And is that what you think the President means when he talks today about America needing to talk again about his gun laws?
Well, I certainly hope so. I would like to have the greatest faith in the President. I have noticed that over this period of time that he has been President, the President often makes a promise and then after a short period of time changes the subject. He has done that again and again. So I hope that on this important subject that we have been wrestling with now for decade after decade, that he maintains focus, attention, high energy, drive, and change.
Dr. Lipman, fascinating to talk to you, and thank you so much for joining us.
It's good to talk to you, Hugh.
Dr. Alan Lipman, good of him to talk to us today from Washington, D.C. He's a clinical psychologist and director of the Center for the Study of Violence